I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
27 years after Princess Diana's mysterious death, Buckingham Palace has dropped a revelation so explosive it could shatter the monarchy's carefully guarded image. During quiet renovations at Kensington Palace, builders stumbled upon a sealed chamber that hadn't been touched since Diana's final days. Inside, an ornate jewelry box engraved with a chilling message for anyone daring enough to uncover the truth. When Princess Anne was summoned to catalog the contents, what began as routine royal duty quickly twisted into a nightmare of betrayal, cover-ups, and danger. Hidden inside were letters, secret bank documents, and even Diana's own confessions, all pointing to a conspiracy so powerful it raises one terrifying question. Who really silenced the people's princess? The spring of 2024 was supposed to bring simple renovations to Kensington's quieter halls, but instead it revealed a ghostly secret locked away for decades. Behind a sealed wooden panel covered in dust, workers discovered a forgotten room, frozen in time since the last days of Diana's life. The chamber looked untouched, like it was waiting for someone brave enough to open its secrets. When Buckingham Palace was alerted, Princess Anne was chosen to lead the investigation. As one of the most senior royals, loyal to her duty and famed for her discretion, Anne seemed the perfect choice. But stepping into that eerie room, she realized this wasn't just duty, it was destiny. Dust lay thick on Diana's gowns, boxes of handwritten notes sat stacked in corners, and framed photos stared back like frozen witnesses of a life cut short. Anne's emotions hit hard. Her relationship with her late sister-in-law had been complicated. At first, she brushed Diana off as fragile, too emotional, maybe even hungry for attention. But away from flashing cameras, Anne had glimpsed the other side. Diana's fierce devotion to her sons, her fearless advocacy for causes the monarchy often ignored, her fire beneath the polished smile. Thousands of forgotten belongings lay scattered in front of her. But only one object froze Princess Anne in her tracks. Hidden at the back of a dusty shelf, half covered by a silk scarf, was a jewelry box unlike anything else in the room, crafted from dark rosewood and inlaid with glowing pearls and sapphires. It gleamed with an unsettling beauty, even through decades of dust. The piece didn't just shine, it radiated secrecy. Anne picked it up carefully, the box heavier than she expected, as if it carried more than gold and stones. Her gloved fingers traced the edges, eyes narrowing at the flawless details. That's when she saw it. An inscription carved faintly into the base of the lid, almost as if it was never meant to be discovered. For those who dare seek truth, DS. The initials slammed into her like a cold wave. Diana Spencer. Not Princess of Wales, not the glamorous royal title, just her raw name. Personal. Defiant, rebellious, Anne's stomach tightened. Had Diana left behind more than gowns and souvenirs? Had she planted a secret meant to outlive her? Why would she leave such a cryptic warning buried in beauty? Anne clutched the box tighter, her heartbeat quickening. This wasn't just jewelry, it was a message, maybe even a last cry for help. A puzzle disguised as a gift, and whoever opened it would need the courage to face truths the palace had buried. Later that night, Anne sat alone in her private quarters, the jewelry box placed on a velvet cloth before her. She couldn't pull her eyes from the engraving. For those who dare seek truth. S. The words echoed in her mind like a ghost refusing to leave. She wasn't one for theatrics, but this felt different, urgent, almost dangerous. Finally, with steady hands, Anne opened the lid. Her breath caught. Inside were treasures fit for a queen. Burmese ruby earrings that burned with fire, a sapphire bracelet sparkling like frozen starlight, and a pendant of emerald and diamonds so sharp it looked like it could cut glass. The jewels seemed to glow with their own fire. But as Anne turned them over one by one, her sharp eye caught something disturbing. Etched into the backs of each piece were markings that had no place in royal archives. Strange symbols, odd initials, and mysterious numbers she had never seen in any official inventory. She leaned in, grabbing a magnifying glass. Her pulse quickened as the details came into focus. Some marks looked like coordinates. Others resembled case numbers or cryptic dates. One brooch even carried a code strikingly similar to an international bank reference. Anne's frown deepened. These weren't keepsakes of love. They were clues. Breadcrumbs left behind by someone who knew danger was closing in. Her attention shifted back to the box itself. Running her fingers along its carved grooves, she searched for hidden details. Then, almost by accident, or maybe fate, her thumb pressed against a raised panel at the base. A faint click echoed, and the bottom shifted slightly. Anne froze. Holding her breath, she slid the hidden compartment open. Inside, tightly packed, was a bundle of handwritten letters bound with a pale blue ribbon. The faint scent of lavender still lingered, ghostly and heartbreaking. Beneath the letters lay glossy photographs. Diana herself, but not as the world knew her. In wigs, scarves, and plain clothes, she appeared in places that screamed secrecy. Quiet cafes, shadowy parking garages, unfamiliar private homes. None of it matched the polished image the press sold of the Princess of Wales. And then Anne saw it, tucked at the bottom, gleaming under the dim light, a silver key. Dangling from it was a small tag, Zurich Deposit Box 837L. Anne's chest tightened. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached back for the letters. The first envelope carried her own name, written in Diana's unmistakable looping script. To Anne, please read if I am gone. Her breath caught. The date in the corner made her blood run cold. Just 3 days before Diana's death in Paris. Slowly, she unfolded the letter. The ink was smudged in places, hurried, almost desperate. Her eyes locked on the opening line, and her heart nearly stopped. If you're reading this, then they succeeded in silencing me. For a moment, the room tilted around Anne. This wasn't nostalgia. This was a warning from the grave. Her grip on the letter trembled, but her eyes stayed locked on Diana's desperate handwriting. Every curve of the script carried urgency. The ink slanted forward, as if written in a race against time. Diana's words began gently, almost like a private letter to family. Then they turned sharp, grave, and chilling. She described a glittering charity gala in 1995, the night her suspicions first took root. The event was meant to raise funds for children's causes she had fiercely championed. But when Diana traced where the money went, something was terribly wrong. The overseas programs never received their funding. When she pressed quietly for answers, she was met with half-truths, evasions, and then threats. The deeper she pushed, the darker it became. Anne turned to the next page and froze. It was a spreadsheet written in Diana's own hand. Lists of numbers, secret bank transfers, and coded accounts meticulously copied out. What the princess uncovered was shocking. Funds meant for landmine victims, children's hospitals, and women's shelters had been siphoned away into private accounts. Some led back to high-ranking businessmen. Others, far more disturbing, pointed toward names with direct ties to the royal household itself. Diana's voice in the letter grew colder, no longer soft or pleading, but sharp with resolve. She wrote of shadowy late-night meetings with investigative journalists, one French, another Swiss, men who were already circling the edges of a conspiracy that could shake nations. She described using code names, arranging dead drops in secret locations, and even realizing she was being watched. By the end of the page, the writing felt like a whisper of defiance frozen in ink. Diana confessed she had started recording conversations, taping private discussions, and hiding them in places only she knew. Whistleblowers had slipped into Diana's world like shadows, terrified but desperate, handing her documents and testimony that painted a deadly picture. As Anne read on, her pulse hammered in her chest. She had never once imagined Diana capable of something this calculated. For years, she had dismissed her as impulsive, emotional, sometimes reckless. But this was no recklessness. This was strategy. Diana had known the predators circling her, and she had mapped them out piece by piece, leaving behind proof because she knew, one day, they might silence her. The tone of the letter softened only when Diana spoke of her sons. "I am not afraid to die," she had written, "but I am afraid for William and Harry, afraid of what they will inherit if this truth is buried with me." Anne felt tears sting her eyes. She hadn't expected this. To realize how deeply she had misjudged Diana, the scandals, the heartbreak, the chaos, They had only been the surface. Beneath it all was a mother fighting against the shadows, manipulating the very crown itself. Anne's hand froze as she reached the final line of the letter, underlined twice in Diana's hurried script. "If you find this, Anne, then know. I left behind a final insurance policy. Everything is hidden in a Swiss bank vault." Her gaze flicked back to the small silver key lying on the table. Suddenly, it wasn't just metal. It was a burden, heavy with destiny. The truth Diana died for wasn't gone. It was waiting, locked away, and Anne wasn't the only one who might be searching. Zurich. A private jet sliced through the morning fog, landing without fanfare. Princess Anne had slipped out of Britain under absolute secrecy. No aides, no courtiers, only a handful of security who had been handed a false itinerary. Even they didn't know her true mission. The key Diana left was tucked in the inner pocket of Anne's coat, resting over her heart like a silent vow. The bank she approached was centuries old, a fortress of discretion, accustomed to guarding secrets that could topple governments. Anne stepped to the counter, her voice calm though her pulse thundered. She placed the key and the tag marked 837L before the clerk. The bank clerk studied her ID, gave a curt nod, and guided Anne through a maze of security doors, each one colder, more sterile, more suffocating than the last. Finally, she was left inside a private viewing room. The silence was absolute as the steel deposit box was placed before her. Her hands hovered just for a breath before she pulled it open. Stacks of documents stared back at her. Ledgers, receipts, transfers, all arranged with obsessive precision. Color-coded folders carried Diana's unmistakable handwriting, neat yet urgent. But the real chill came from the bottom of the box. Tapes and digital discs, each one labeled with a date and subject. One, stark and terrifying, read simply, "If I disappear." With trembling fingers, Anne slid the first disc into the player. The screen flickered, and suddenly Diana appeared. No makeup, no glamour, just a woman sitting in a modest flat, her face pale, her eyes exhausted but burning with purpose. "If you're watching this," Diana began, her voice steady, "then I've been silenced. But you must know what I found, and why I could not walk away." Anne leaned forward, heart racing. Names spilled from Diana's lips, not only shadowy businessmen and distant investors, but members of the aristocracy themselves. Men who waved from palace balconies, who smiled for cameras at charity galas. According to Diana, those very charities were fronts, laundering millions into offshore accounts, arming covert deals, fueling operations no one dared admit existed. Her voice grew sharper, darker. She admitted she had tried to alert officials. Some dismissed her. Others warned her to stop. She described the moment she suspected her car brakes had been tampered with, how she no longer trusted her own bodyguards, how she crept through back doors and encrypted her phone calls like a fugitive in her own life. Her composure cracked only when she whispered of William and Harry. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she said, "I must leave them something more than fairy tales. They deserve the truth." The screen went black. Anne sat frozen, the weight of the revelation pressing into her chest. Her stomach churned. This wasn't scandal anymore. This was a conspiracy that spanned nations, industries, and even the crown itself. Diana had not been paranoid. She had been right, and she had paid the ultimate price. Anne's chest tightened as the truth settled in. When she turned back toward the bank clerk outside the viewing room, his expression was flat, unreadable. Then he spoke, his words slicing through the silence. "You're not the first to ask about this box," he said quietly. "Someone else came 2 weeks ago, claimed they were family." Anne's grip on the key hardened. Her stomach dropped. The race had already begun, and she was no longer the only one holding the pieces of Diana's truth. Back in London, Princess Anne carried herself with a calm exterior, but inside, the Swiss discovery had shaken her to the core. Diana hadn't been imagining shadows. She had been documenting, exposing, and being hunted, and now that same hunt was circling Anne. She secured Diana's files in a private vault far away from royal estates, hidden under layers of secrecy. But what she didn't know was that eyes were already on her. From the moment her plane touched down at Heathrow, she was being tracked. The first signs were subtle. Her private family phone, normally crystal clear, began to click and echo during calls. Then came the mail delays, envelopes arriving already opened and resealed. Soon after, her car, maintained with military precision, suddenly failed in her own secure garage. Mechanics brushed it off as rodent damage. Anne knew better. The brake line had been severed. Alarmed, she called on an old friend, a retired British intelligence officer. His sweep confirmed her worst fears. Malware laced her phone. Hidden bugs wired her study. Someone was listening. Someone already knew she had Diana's evidence, and they were waiting to see what she'd do next. The pressure tightened when an unmarked package arrived at her residence. No return address, only a slip of paper inside, bearing a single name, Timothy Rad. Anne's breath caught. She remembered him. Diana's private secretary, a quiet, fiercely loyal man who had disappeared from public life after her death. The note included a location. That night, Anne tracked him to a modest home outside Bath. Their meeting place was no accident. A forgotten chapel, lit only by flickering candles. When Timothy emerged from the shadows, his face was weathered by years of silence. He wasted no time. "Your sister-in-law was not alone," he said firmly. "She trusted a few of us, people who had no stake in the machine. We've kept watch, waiting for someone brave enough to carry the flame." Anne sat frozen as Timothy's words stripped away the last illusion. He spoke of the so-called investigation into Diana's death, riddled with gaps big enough to swallow the truth. Evidence ignored, witnesses silenced, CCTV from Paris lost, and the infamous white Fiat, seen by multiple onlookers, conveniently dismissed without explanation. "It was never meant to be solved," Timothy whispered. "Only quietly closed." The weight of it crashed down on Anne's shoulders. Diana hadn't died chasing drama. She had died chasing the truth. And now, by daring to open the box, Anne had stepped straight into the same crosshairs. That night, when she returned home, a chill ran through her. A plain envelope lay waiting under her door. No signature, no seal. Just 5 words in sharp handwriting. "Stop digging or join her." Her fingers shook slightly as she held it, but her eyes blazed. The threat was clear, but they had underestimated her. Fear had never dictated her life, and now that she knew what Diana had died trying to reveal, retreat was impossible. Diana's voice was no longer a whisper in the shadows. It was a roar from the grave, and Anne vowed she would not let it be silenced again. From that moment, the hunt turned into a mission. Days blurred into nights as Anne retreated behind locked doors, poring over Diana's files like sacred scripture. The ledgers from Zurich, the handwritten letters, the testimonies from Diana's hidden allies. Each detail stacked into a portrait too grim to ignore. Diana hadn't stumbled into danger blindly. She had dug straight into the heart of an international operation, one rooted in royal privilege, disguised as charity, and fueled by greed. Anne built timelines, cross-referenced names, and traced hidden accounts. And with every connection she uncovered, the truth sharpened like a knife. Diana's landmine campaigns, her trips to war zones, her visits to refugee camps, they hadn't just been humanitarian missions, they had placed her right on the front lines of something far darker. Beneath the glittering photo ops and smiling headlines, Anne uncovered the ugly truth. Royal movements had been weaponized as cover, while the world watched parades and charity galas. Shadowy figures conducted arms deals, moved blood money across borders, and built empires on lies. What cut deepest was the betrayal. Diana had trusted some of these very people. She had dined beside them at banquets, defended them in interviews, even called some friends. Yet those polished smiles had belonged to the same machine that eventually crushed her. Anne's hands shook as she traced the financial trails. Among the reports were transactions signed off by members of the palace's own inner circle. When she cross-referenced accounts, travel logs, and foundation records, one name surfaced again and again, a name that made her stomach twist. A blood relative, someone with an impeccable public image, someone she never thought could be part of this. Sickened, she turned back to Timothy Radcliffe. Together, they sought out one of Diana's old allies at the Red Cross. After much hesitation, the man finally broke his silence, confirming what Anne dreaded. Diana had been preparing to release a joint exposé with a journalist, A bombshell report that would have implicated not just crooked businessmen, but royal insiders and government contractors as well. That report never reached daylight. The journalist was found dead weeks after Diana, ruled an overdose. Another case quietly closed. In the last of Diana's files, Anne unearthed a folder marked in bold letters, Operation Marionette. Inside were communications between foreign intelligence operatives and a private security firm once hired to monitor Diana's movements. Her breath caught when she reached the final page. A chilling directive. Ensure containment before Paris trip. Risk elevated. Her pulse raced as she sifted further. Then came the proof that froze her blood. A grainy surveillance still that had never been shown to the public. The Paris tunnel. Just moments before the crash, the infamous white Fiat was visible, but behind it, another car. Unidentified, never mentioned in any official record, and traced the plates. They led back to a company tied directly to an associate of a palace staffer. Her hands trembled. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't speculation. This was confirmation. Diana's crash had not been an accident. It had been staged. And the people who orchestrated it, they weren't relics of the past. They were alive, powerful, shielded, and still watching. Anne stood frozen in the dim light of her study, one hand resting on the grainy image. Diana had been hunted, and the hunter's trail was still fresh. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in a room now drowning in secrets. Papers, files, and photographs were scattered across her desk like fragments of a life long ignored. At the center, pinned above the chaos, was Diana's smile, radiant, full of life, captured in a moment before she was marked for death. For the first time, Anne didn't see her through the cold eyes of duty, or as a skeptical royal who once dismissed her. This time, she saw the truth. A woman screaming to be heard, fighting alone while the world called her dramatic. A tear slid down Anne's cheek, shocking her. She was not one for emotion, never had been. Discipline had been her armor, distance her survival. But tonight, the armor cracked. She pressed her face into her hands and sobbed quietly. Steady, controlled, but broken. She wept for the sister-in-law she had misjudged, for the young woman who walked into the lion's den armed only with conviction and a mother's heart. Memories stabbed like knives. Anne remembered brushing off Diana's fears as theatrics, her intensity as immaturity. But every letter, every tape, every coded message proved the opposite. Diana hadn't been unstable. She had been braver than any of them. She hadn't been chasing attention. She had been chasing protection for her children. Anne's voice cracked into the silence. I should have seen it. I should have asked her. The guilt pressed heavy against her chest. Diana had tried to raise the alarm, but the palace, the press, even family, even Anne herself had turned away. They had labeled her difficult, unstable, attention-seeking. But the truth was now undeniable. Diana hadn't wanted attention. She had wanted safety. She had wanted justice. Anne's hands trembled as she lifted one of the final letters again. The words were seared into her mind. They will never stop until they own everything. Even William and Harry are not safe from the rot behind these walls. I don't fear for myself anymore. I fear what they'll become if no one tells them the truth. Anne clutched the letter to her chest as tears spilled anew. Hot, silent, cleansing. For all the pomp, all the ceremony, for all the crowns, tiaras, and rigid royal duties, this was the truth everyone had missed. Diana was never the threat. She had been the shield, a mother standing alone in the storm, using her own body to protect her boys from forces no one dared name aloud. Anne wiped her face, steadied herself, and then her phone buzzed. A secure line. She answered. Ma'am. Timothy Radcliffe's voice came through, strained and urgent. There's been movement. Anne's blood ran cold. Movement? At Lambrook, Prince George's school. Someone tried to infiltrate the grounds. Security intercepted them. But it's no coincidence. The network is shifting targets. They're coming for William's children now. The line went dead. Anne stared at the phone, her heart slamming in her chest. The danger hadn't ended with Diana. It hadn't even slowed. The shadows were alive, and now they were reaching for William's sons. Not again, not this time. Anne would not stand back. She would fight. The moment the call ended, she was moving. There was no time to funnel alerts through official palace channels. Too many of those lines were already compromised. Instead, she reached only for people she trusted absolutely. First on the list, a retired MI5 director, a man who had once owed Diana a quiet, unspoken favor. Within the hour, a covert protection unit was in motion. Operatives slipped into place around Lambrook, where Prince George was still attending classes. At the same time, another shadow team was deployed across the ocean, tasked with quietly monitoring Harry's location in the United States. Anne knew they were on borrowed time. Every second counted. She left Kensington under the cover of night. Her route scrambled, her communications shielded. With her were flash drives, original letters, financial ledgers, and video files. Everything Diana had died to collect. It was no longer about keeping the evidence safe. It was about unleashing it. The plan was clear. Expose the network before they struck again. But Anne understood the cost. These people had survived in darkness for decades. They would not go down quietly. They would fight back, tooth and nail, with power, money, and blood if necessary. And as MI5 began quietly threading connections between offshore accounts, weapons shipments, and high-ranking officials, Anne faced the unthinkable. For the first time in her life, she was preparing to turn against the very crown she had sworn to protect. She finally did what she had dreaded most. She confronted her own blood. Inside a private room at Clarence House, Princess Anne stood across from two senior royals, both of their names scrawled across Diana's hidden reports. Their faces were calm, polished masks of aristocratic civility. But Anne's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "You knew what she was uncovering," she said coldly, "and you let it happen." One shifted in his chair, eyes flicking downward. There were complexities, things far beyond one woman's comprehension. "No!" Anne snapped, sharper than they had ever heard her speak. "Not complexities. Crimes. And now your silence is no longer enough to protect you." She dropped a thick folder onto the table with a thud. "If anything happens to William, Harry, or their children, this goes public. Every page, every name, every transfer." The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, one of the men leaned forward, his voice a low warning. "You're making enemies you can't even see." Anne's stare was ice. "I already have. And I'm still standing." Meanwhile, MI5 sent word of an attempted breach near Prince William's private estate. A delivery van with no registration had tried to slip past the perimeter. It was stopped, but the cargo inside made blood run cold. Blueprints, surveillance photographs, and a brake system tampered with from a vehicle registered to household staff. This wasn't a robbery. This was a message. Back at Sandringham, Anne watched the live feed as George was escorted from Lambrook under heavy guard. Her hands trembled just slightly, not from fear, but fury. The network was no longer hiding in the shadows. They had declared open war. And then came the strike. An hour later, a black SUV carrying Catherine, George, and Charlotte was forced off a narrow country road by an unidentified vehicle. The car spun, metal crumpling into a ditch. The driver survived. The family crawled out shaken but alive. No serious injuries. But the message was unmistakable. This was no accident. It was a warning shot. The next time, they wouldn't miss. Anne's jaw tightened as she watched the wreckage being cleared. This wasn't a family feud anymore. This was war. And she had already chosen her side. Diana's final victory. The very next morning, Princess Anne stood before a podium in a fortified briefing room. The world's press sat in silence, cameras poised, while MI5 agents stood guard over sealed folders, digital drives, and boxes of evidence. Every shred of Diana's hidden archive now ready to detonate. The truth would no longer rot in the dark. It was about to scorch the light. Anne inhaled deeply, steady, unshaken. Then she spoke. "For years," she began, her voice calm but razor-sharp, "we told the world a story that was incomplete. What was withheld from you, what was kept even from us, is this. Diana, Princess of Wales, did not die as a tabloid spectacle. She died as a woman fighting for justice." Gasps rippled through the room. Within hours, headlines screamed across the globe. Names once untouchable were dragged into the open. High-ranking officials, powerful executives, and yes, even royals. Some were arrested, Others fled. Many resigned in disgrace. Offshore accounts froze overnight. Long-buried investigative files were reopened. The carefully spun web began to snap strand by strand. And at the center of it all was Diana, the woman they once mocked as too emotional, too naive, too impulsive. She was none of those things. She had been right. Now, she was vindicated. Diana had not died in vain. She had died protecting the truth and protecting her sons. In the weeks that followed, Anne stepped out of the shadows with a resolve she had never shown before. Quietly but firmly, she launched the Diana Truth Foundation, an organization devoted to global transparency and charity, the protection of whistleblowers, and the relentless pursuit of investigative journalism. Its mission was simple: carry the torch Diana had lit in secret. Her legacy was no longer tragedy. It was triumph. One quiet evening, alone in her study, Anne returned to the ornate jewelry box. After the storm of revelations, it had been cataloged, sealed, preserved, but not fully emptied. Her fingers traced the velvet lining until they pressed against a faint groove. Click. A hidden panel lifted, revealing a slim cassette tucked in a labeled envelope. The words on the front made Anne's breath catch. For William and Harry. Only if the world finally hears me. Hands trembling, Anne placed it into an old player and pressed play. And then Diana's voice filled the room. Soft, steady, eternal. My dear boys, if this message finds you, then I know you've heard the truth. Not just about what happened to me, but about who you are. You are not symbols. You are not heirs. You are hearts strong enough to change this world. Don't carry fear. Carry courage. That's what I tried to do. That's what I hope you will always keep doing. For yourselves and for those who never had a voice. Tears welled in Anne's eyes. Diana's last gift wasn't just proof or evidence. It was love. Fierce, unshaken, and victorious. Because her final mission was never about fame. It was about truth. It was about shielding her sons from a legacy of silence and exposing the rot hidden behind royal walls. Through Anne's relentless pursuit of justice, the voice they tried to bury was finally heard. Diana was not just a princess. She was a whistleblower, a protector, a mother who never stopped fighting. If you made it this far, sound off in the comments. Do you believe Diana's truth would have changed the monarchy forever if it came out in her lifetime? Make sure to like, share, and subscribe if you want more deep dives like this.